And for those of you who are here for the first time, I was surprised to see quite a number of you here. We're grateful you're here tonight. Glad the tapes are available. Sorry you couldn't have been here during the rest of the week. But for those of you who were here, you'll know the lessons as we took them began with a message on the family and the purpose of God, and then we talked about biblical roles for men and women, and then spoke about marriage being a crucible, and then this morning talked about parents and their responsibilities to children. And tonight I want to talk on the theme of husbands and wives caring for each other. Turn with me in the Scriptures, and we'll read again Scriptures that we've covered before, but in Matthew chapter 19, it's a good place to start again, where Jesus is making his comments on the significance of the family and upon marriage. His words came out of a question that the Pharisees came asking him, trying to trick him into a false answer about divorce. Some Pharisees came to him to test him, and they asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," he replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh.'" As you know, he's quoting from Genesis there. Genesis chapter 1. "So they are no longer two but one. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate," or let not man put asunder. What God has joined together, that statement of Jesus is enough for us, should be enough for us, to be determined to make a marriage work. That ought to be reason enough to give it everything that we've got, and to have the understanding of the supreme importance of the marriage relationship. What God has joined together. Well, it's true that, I said I think on the opening night, my personal conviction is that when a couple is joined together in marriage, or even whether they realize it or not, marriage is a divine institution, and it is a representation of divine grace. And that it's a marriage in God's sight, and to be a permanent union and a permanent relationship, whether or not people recognize it for being that or not, because there's a sense in which marriage is designed in heaven. We talked about the family being born in the mind of God, that it was God's idea, not man's idea. Marriages are designed in heaven. The problem is they have to be put together on earth. The idea, the blueprint is divine, but the materials that we work with are imperfect and often don't seem to fit together the way they should. Marriage is meant to be a lifetime process of discovery about ourselves and about our mates. It's true that we learn things about ourselves that we wouldn't learn any other way, and we learn things about our mates we wouldn't learn any other way except in the intimacy of marriage. And it doesn't take long after you're married to begin to find that out. I remember hearing the story about the young Irish couple that got married, Pat and Kate, and they hadn't been married too long, and they got into a real argument, and Pat didn't realize how much of a temper his young wife Kate had until they got into this argument, and suddenly she lost her temper, and to impress upon her young husband a certain point, she grabbed a skillet and whopped him up the side of the head with it, knocked him cold. He fell to the floor, the kitchen floor, completely out of things, and she was immediately remorseful. She dropped the skillet and knelt beside him on the floor and lifted his head in her arms and began to shake him and say, oh, Pat, I'm sorry. Wake up, Pat, dear. It's me. Do you know me? Do you know me?" Pat opened one eye and says, "I'm just beginning to know you." So, marriage is a lifetime process of us getting to know one another. In the things that we share tonight, I want to suggest that you keep three basic points in mind. Not that we'll be dealing with them, but they're just good to have in the back of your mind. The first one is that marriage is intended to be for a lifetime. It's a covenant in God, and God's covenants are permanent. That's why it's called a covenant of marriage. Marriage is meant to be for a lifetime. No couple that gets married ought to go into it with any other way. Unfortunately, many of them do, with the idea that, well, if it doesn't work, we can call it quits and try it with somebody else. But that's not God's idea. As Jesus said in Matthew 19 about response to the questions about divorce, when they said, well, then why did Moses give them a right to get a divorce? And Jesus said, Moses did that because your hardness is of the heart. because of your hearts being hardened. But it was not that way in the beginning. God intended it to be permanent. So let's keep in mind in the things we share tonight that marriage is meant to be for a lifetime. We said the other night about marriage being a covenant and giving some of the definitions of covenant. One of them, good definition of covenant means that in covenant you abandon the option to quit. You rule that out. You can do everything else but quit. So marriage is meant to be for a lifetime. A second point we mentioned is that marriage is not 50-50, it's 90-10. You don't go into marriage thinking that each person is bringing so much, half to the marriage. If you consider it on that basis, your marriage is doomed from the start. It's not 50-50, it's 90-10. Each person ought to consider that he's going to have to give it 90% in order for it to work. If you don't, when the arguments begin to come, if it's 50-50, you're going to feel your husband or wife's only giving 45%, so you'll back off to 45, and then it's 40-40, and then it's 30-30, and pretty soon the grace and the life and the union is gone. So marriage isn't 50-50, it's 90-10. A third thought, not scriptural but true, which you just need to keep in mind, is that inside every husband there's a little boy who never grew up. And inside every wife there's a little girl who never grew up. We simply need to remember that that's true. Now, it's not all bad either. It's real. We are all a mixture, men and women both, all our lives. We remain a mixture of innocence and idealism combined with stubborn adolescence and immaturity and increasing cynicism and negativism and so forth. But there is in all of us, and always remains in all of us, something of the child. In fact, Jesus even said, unless you would turn and become like little children, you'd not know or be able to enter the kingdom of God. Not childishness, but childlikeness is a much to be desired quality, spiritually and in a marriage. So remember that inside every man there's a little boy, and inside every woman there's a little girl. And try to be patient with the adolescent while you cherish the innocent. Okay? All right, now we want to spend a while talking about the do's and the don'ts involved in caring for each other. And we want to again begin by talking about some do's and don'ts for husbands concerning their wives. Let's turn over again to Ephesians chapter 5 and look at those familiar words again. Now, we mentioned the other day when we were talking on using these scriptures, that it was significant that Paul spoke first to the women about their necessity to submit to their husbands when he started teaching on marriage, before he spoke to the husbands. He said first to the women to submit to their husbands, and then later he said, husbands, love your wives. We're reversing the order in our discussion tonight, just to begin with husbands. Verse 25 in Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds it and cares for it just as Christ does for the church, for we are members of his body. For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And this is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. All right, husbands, I want to speak directly to you and just suggest at this point a list of 8 ways to love your wife. 8 aspects of fulfilling your responsibility as a husband. The first one is to be willing to honor her before men. Learn how if you don't know how, and make the effort to praise her in public. Learn to be attentive, to show respect. It amazes me sometimes in pastoral counseling with couples that are having difficulty. It amazes me sometimes what their almost total lack of respect men seem to have for their wives. They don't think of them and they don't treat of them as ladies. Christian men. Men, we need to cultivate being attentive. We need to cultivate the ability to show respect. We need to know how and to practice treating our wives like ladies. To praise them and honor them before other men. To let it be known in public. Be attentive to your wife in public. How you walk with her. How you escort her in a public place. How you defer to her or look after her moving into a public place or being seated at a restaurant or other places. To show the kind of respect, to show the kind of honor, to show the kind of care, to show the kind of love. It's an interesting experience sometime to be in a public place and just become a kind of witness and watch how couples behave. Watch how husbands treat their wives, or wives their husbands. And sometimes it's pretty shocking. Sometimes it's very touching. But we need to learn how to honor our wives before men. A second do for husbands is that we need to learn how to respect our wives' feelings. Now, when we were talking on the lesson of biblical roles for men and women, we talked about how God made them male and female. Now, I'll take it back. It was in the third lesson where we listed these male and female characteristics, stressing how they were characteristics and not character flaws. And one of the characteristics of the way God made a woman is that God made women to be, in a sense, dominated by their emotions. They are easily touched or moved by their emotions. A woman reacts more in terms of her emotions, while a man reacts more in terms of what he thinks. A woman in terms of what she feels. So knowing that, men, we need to learn how to respect our wives' feelings. And again, not to expect them to act or react the way we do. To show sensitivity and concern. There are certain problems that are more apt to recur in women because of this than in men. Our wives have tremendous struggles with guilt and tremendous struggles with insecurity. I think I mentioned the other day that you can make your wife feel guilty is just to clam up. Now, many times men don't do that intentionally, and wives, you need to understand that men, we'll talk about this later, but that men often find it difficult to articulate their feelings. Women are more vocal than men. But men, we need to make the effort to be sensitive and to show concern and to be willing to deal with our wives' insecurity and guilt. And lots of times we just simply need to take the initiative to talk and to encourage them to talk and let them unload and dump their feelings. And because they tend, if they don't have a chance every few days to open up and share, those insecurities and those guilt feelings will begin to loom larger and larger, and they'll begin to take their toll emotionally and spiritually and even physically. Women tend to suffer many things physically, not because they're, quote, the weaker sex, or not because they're not as healthy as men, but because by the way women were designed, their emotions and their physical apparatus are more closely tied together. And a woman's emotional distress will show up more in her physical body more rapidly and more severely than with the man. Now, emotional stress will take its toll on a man too, as we well know, and stress is one of the great killers in America today. But by the very nature, the very way God created woman, sensitive to her feelings and gentle and trusting and all of these other things, her emotions are tied into her physical well-being, and her actual physical health may well depend in large part upon our ability as husbands to look after our wives in this realm, to be willing to serve in such a way that, and to communicate in such a way and care for in such a way that they can feel free to express those uncertainties or insecurities or feelings of guilt. I don't know where I read it, but there's a kind of an illustration, funny illustration that illustrates the difference between a man and woman concerning these things of insecurity. Somebody said, with a man and woman sitting at a meal, and you ask the man, where did he get the steak? And he'll say, well, I got it at the A&P. You ask the woman, where did you get the steak? She'll say, why? What's wrong with it? There's something about the difference in the way men and women react. The man reacted irrationally. Somebody asked him a question, where did he buy the steak? The answer was, well, the fact is he got the steak at the A&P. You ask the woman the same question, out of insecurity, she will feel that there's something implied in the question. Why? What's wrong with it? Now, perhaps it's It's over-dramatized and slightly exaggerated, but it makes the point, men, that we have a responsibility to respect our wives' feelings. Third point, husbands, we have a responsibility to help our wives rule in their own realm. Now, I don't mean this in any demeaning way or any put-down, any kind of put-down. All I'm saying is that basically the areas of responsibility in most cases for men and women are decidedly different. Now, we mentioned today how it's true that 65% of women in America today are in the workforce. That means they also have jobs. But they also have responsibilities in the home. And basically we've considered the home responsibility, the care for the home and the children, as the woman's major part of a woman's world, or of her responsibility. A wife's world on that basis is considerably different than that of her husband's. It's a different world. In some way, it's a smaller world. And in some ways, her horizons fall closer to the boundaries of her own home. A man, by the nature of his career, is often in touch with a lot of things out there in the world and various areas in comparison to, and so his horizons are broader and cast farther away than the horizons of a woman's responsibilities. But we need to remember, men, that even though the boundaries of her responsibilities and the horizons of her world are not the same as ours, and in some ways may seem considerably smaller, nevertheless, her world is just as important as ours. And we need to understand that. And on that basis, then, for her, for the wife that we're responsible for and that God holds us responsible for her world in where she spends much of her time in her world, in the home and with the children. In her world, a stopped-up sink or roaches in the cabinet are crises that must be dealt with. And they're real crises. Now, I know it's easy for a man to come into a situation like that when he's had great big things out there and so forth. And it's so easy, men, if we don't watch it, we'll slip into a kind of a patronizing or a kind of indifference that we will communicate to our wives as if this doesn't really matter. But it does. Things like that can be real crises. And we need to understand it. We need somehow, by God's grace, to gain a perspective about the important things that evolve and revolve around in our wives' own world that's different from ours. How do we help her rule in her realm? By seeing her world as important as ours. By recognizing the significance of her horizons the same as we do our own. We need to reinforce her authority with the children. We gave an illustration about this pastor that Ern and I both know, who was continually undercutting his wife's authority with his children. We need to provide a united front, husband and wife, mother and father, with the children, so that the children know, even if the father's away, the children know that the wife, the mother, is operating under the authority and the delegated authority of the husband. That while the husband is the head of the house, when he's out of the house, the wife speaks with his authority. And the husband needs to support his wife in that. And she needs to be able to feel that security. Tremendous frustration if she's unable to do that. How do we help our wives rule in their realm? We need to provide financial stability and security. Now that doesn't mean that we have to necessarily be wealthy or overly prosperous financially. Any person with any kind of any kind of income, any kind of job, any kind of normal economic situation, in any family, that can be provided, but it has to be provided by the husband. It's the husband's responsibility, I believe, to provide the financial security and stability to her husband, to his wife. Now, you may pay all the bills, and that's okay. And I think that's proper. I don't think there's anything wrong. I believe that's right when a man handles all that himself. I don't believe there's anything wrong, however, when a man delegates much of that to his wife. But if he does delegate it, if he expects her to make purchases and to pay bills and so forth, he needs to give her the kind of guidelines about how much she can be allowed to pay and what the income is and how much they can afford to spend in a given period of time. And that needs to be decided ahead of time rather than wait for the bills to come in and then for you to start fussing at your wife because she spent too much money. If you give her the responsibility to make the purchases and things like this, when the time of accounting comes, but you haven't put limits or safe boundaries on her or to let her know what the situation is, it's not fair to her then to complain that she hasn't been thrifty or frugal. We need to provide financial security and stability for our wives to help her rule in her realm. All right, a fourth step in being responsible for, a fourth due in husbands being responsible for the wives is that we need to place some loving boundaries around her for her own sake. There are some things that she needs to be protected from. One of them is that it often happens, but it shouldn't happen, men, and that is that we dump unfair burdens on our wives. It's true that we need to be open and need to be caring and need to communicate with our wives, but we also need wisdom. That there are some things that ought to be carried by the husband or the father that the wife oughtn't to have to feel the burden for. We ought to learn to limit the concerns that she carries. And when she begins to feel a concern for about something that she shouldn't have to worry about, that we ought to be able to say, honey, don't you worry about that. You let me take care of that. My God, think what a different world it would have been if Adam had done that with Eve when she went to the door to answer the knock from the snake. If he'd have put down his newspaper and stood up and pushed her aside and said, honey, let me handle this. It's not your concern. What a different outcome there might have been. We need to not only protect them from certain facts and certain truths. I don't know exactly how to say this. It's true that our wives are entitled to know, in many cases, more than we tell them. And it's a real frustration for a wife when her husband's too close-mouthed and when he doesn't share things out of his own life and out of his own affairs that she would like to know and that she's entitled to know. But there are certain things, men, that we ought to instinctively know or learn how that it would not be right to share some things with the wife. There are some things that she has a right to know. There are some things that she has a right not to know. There are certain things that I know about certain situations that I've kept to myself through the years concerning things that Alice knows some things about, but not everything. Why would I not want her to be troubled with some certain unpleasant negative details? Because she would be hurt, because she would be grieved if she knew certain things about certain situations. And it's not for any desire on my part to hide anything from her or to keep things from her. My desire is that she live in peace and comfort under my care. And so there are certain mean and nasty things that come to mind in my world, that come to my knowledge concerning certain situations that it would be unfair to burden her with. And at times when some of those things sneak through, or through circumstances she lays hold of certain concerns or burdens, or your wife lays hold of certain concerns or burdens that are properly to be handled by the head of the house, or that are properly a male responsibility. It is our responsibility, men, to lift those things off our wives and to very gently say to them, don't be concerned about that. Let me worry about that. That means that we shouldn't be asking our wives to make decisions outside their realm, to be worrying about things that they don't really have responsibility for. It's a terrible thing to be burdened with a concern for things that you don't have any responsibility or any ability to do anything about. And one of the measuring sticks that we can use for a situation like this, if it's something that our wives can't possibly do anything about or change, something that's negative or hurtful or harmful or burdensome, then why should they have to be involved with it emotionally? So we need to learn how to place loving, protective boundaries around our wives for their sake. The fifth point we've already touched on briefly, and that is we need men to learn how to communicate. I suppose that's harder for most men than many other things. As we said a while ago, men tend to be kind of closed-mouthed, many men do, and in comparison, women tend to be more vocal. And it's a real effort at times for a man to communicate, to articulate his feelings. But we need to learn how to do that. A sixth point we need to avoid double standards with our wives. Now, we talked about this earlier in terms of a double standard in dealing with our children, about we can't expect to live by one set of principles while we preach other principles to our own kids. We can't expect to preach a need for being submitted to authority when we break the speed limit and cheat on our income tax and this sort of thing, so far as our children are concerned, in setting examples. But the same thing's true in terms of the way we treat our wives. Selfishness can be a very subtle thing. It is so easy for a man, when he's carrying the reins, when he's holding the responsibility for the home and for the care for his wife, to indulge himself certain privileges and certain opportunities and certain indulgences that he will not allow his wife, because he's carrying the purse strings, because he's the one that's making most of the decisions. It's awfully easy for a certain amount of selfishness to come into that, and we tend to justify indulging ourselves, but we tend to be critical or be a bit standoffish or hesitant to allow the same privilege to our wives. And as I say, it can be fairly subtle. I remember years ago down in Florida, when Alice and I were living there, we had some real fine Christian charismatic friends that we spent time with, and he was a prosperous a professional man. They had a lovely home, and he had a nice boat. They lived on a canal there in Fort Lauderdale, and she helped him out in his professional office, and she was driving an old Chrysler, about 7 or 8 years old, that was limping around and chugging and smoking and this sort of thing, and she was really wanting a new car. And they were over visiting us one afternoon, and she was complaining in a kind of a good-natured way, but complaining to him, saying, "Honey, I really need a new car." And he began to lecture her on the fact, "Well, no, you can just fix that car up and really don't have money to buy a new car." And he just told me minutes before how proud he was of his new $16,000 boat that he'd bought. And the thing was so obvious, and we were good friends, that I just couldn't help but needle him a little with it. I said, "Yeah, your wife can drive a 9-year-old car, but it's necessary for you to have your $16,000 boat." And he first turned red and a little angry, and then he laughed and admitted that he'd been caught. But he's a fine Christian man, charismatic, loved the Lord, loved his wife, loved his family. But it had been so easy to justify his swapping in his 16-foot boat for a 24-foot boat, while his wife was still driving around in an old 9-year-old Chrysler clunker. So men, beware of the double standard. And don't claim privileges. Men, we shouldn't claim privileges or shouldn't claim blessings for ourselves that we're not willing to share with our wives. The eighth I'm just going to mention, and then if time permits, I'm going to come back and share a little bit about the whole realm of sexual relationship. The eighth point in the do's is, husbands, is that we need to be fervent and gentle lovers. Now, that's all I'm going to say about it at this point, but I am going to say some things which I trust will be helpful and tasteful at the same time, and in good taste later on. But this is the eighth point. The whole sexual realm is so fraught with both privilege and opportunity and peril that we just really have to spend a little time with it. All right, now, moving on, I want to just share briefly 3 don'ts for husbands. We've been listing do's. Now I want to talk about some don'ts. Men, don't tease or belittle your wife in public. That's a common custom for men. I mean, little things like you talk about the little woman to your friends, or, she's my old ball and chain. Or you'll say something else in a teasing way and do it publicly. It's funny to you, and it may be funny to the other people that you're talking about. But most humor is at somebody's expense. And teasing is always at somebody's expense. And I want to tell you that kind of activity, that kind of habit or custom of teasing our wives in public is not only cowardly, it's cruel. And what may seem to be just a tiny little joke and good for a snicker for you and your friends may bring real pain and humiliation to your wife. I've seen it happen time and time again when I've been in gatherings of people or out with a few couples. And I've been guilty of it. There are a couple of particular instances of funny things that happened when Alice and I were first married that I used to delight in telling. Because to me they were funny, and other people here they were funny. And I learned after some years how much pain it was bringing Alice. And I covenanted with myself I'd never do that again, and I've never told those things again. Now, by my standards, they weren't all that bad, but anything that causes your wife pain or causes your wife humiliation ought to be off limits. What you think is funny will shame and humiliate her. Second, don't. Don't expect your wife to be a mechanical genius. Men, she just isn't. Women just aren't. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be, or they can't learn how to, adjust a spark plug or tune a carburetor or fill up the car, all these other things. But by and large, they just aren't turned on to that realm. And for them, it's not only a chore, it's like there's a kind of a mental, psychological block against it. And you just better adjust to that. Every once in a while, when your wife drives a car and it runs out of gas, just take it on yourself to take the responsibility for you to keep the car filled up. Now, you'll save yourself a lot of grief emotionally and mentally, and you'll save your wife a lot of grief emotionally and mentally. You can lecture her from now until the kingdom comes about the necessity of checking the gas gauge when she gets in the car and goes out. But in all likelihood, she won't do it. She gets in the car, she starts out to go to the hairdresser's, and she runs out of gas. And she calls you on the phone at the office. She says, honey, I was on the way to the hairdresser's, and the car ran out of gas. What'll I do? You explode over the phone. You silly goose, why didn't you look the gas gauge? You know how she's going to react? She's going to think you don't care whether or not she gets her hair fixed. Now, don't expect her to excel or to take those things into consideration. We may as well add this at the same place because it's really a don't for wife. Wives, I know one of the things that may bug you is that for 15 years, your husband, when he changes his clothes, he drops his dirty underwear on the floor and leaves it there in the bathroom. And when he just take a little simple step to reach down and pick it up and put it in the dirty clothes hamper. And you will seethe about that. You will lecture him morning, noon, and night. Pick up your dirty clothes and put them in the clothes hamper. 15 years later, he's going to be doing the same thing, probably, because a man doesn't think in those terms. So wife, save yourself and your husband some grief and enjoy, serve the Lord and Master of your home, and with joy pick up his dirty clothes and put them in the hamper yourself. Wives, don't expect your husbands to be mechanical genius. Men, it's your responsibility to keep the appliances running in the home. It's your responsibility to see that the sink is unstopped. Now, it's true your wife could do those things, and you could buy her little handbooks, and you could give her lectures, and you could take her through some sort of apprentice course, or you could send her to some kind of a training class at night school and so forth. But why do all that? You're going against, I don't know what, nature or something, but you're going against femininity in that regard. Just don't expect your wife to be a mechanical genius. You take care of those things. You take that responsibility. That's one of the ways that you can honor her and serve her and care for her and protect her and make her feel cherished, that you care enough to do those things. Oh, there's a long list. We won't go on with any more. Mention one other, though. For your sake, for your wife's sake, for the Lord's sake, for Pete's sake, men, don't compare your wife to other women, especially not to your mother. Don't compare her with your mother or her cooking with your mother's cooking. Now, there may be justification for feeling on your part that there's some things that she could do better. And there's a lot of things that you probably never do as good as your mother did. But you'll have a lot happier home, and there'll be more of the kingdom of God in your home if you just learn at an early stage not to make that kind of odious comparison with your mother. It's not that my mother wasn't a wonderful woman, but my wife's a wonderful woman in her own right, and there's no sense in comparing. And most women, they can't help, most women are threatened by their mothers-in-law, or by their husband's memory, or by their husband's appreciation for their mother. And it's just one of those unnecessary burdens that wives ought not have to be burdened with. And one of the ways that you can add to peace and harmony between the relationship between your wife and your mother, if your mother's still living, is not to do that. You can speak well of your mother and you can speak well of your wife. But as the famous English author Samuel Johnson said, comparisons are odious. And especially in that realm. So men, don't compare your wife to other women. Okay, let's now talk about some do's and don'ts for wives. Let's read again the little verses that have to do with the wife's responsibility to her husband, backing up a little in Ephesians 5. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so wives also should submit to their husbands in everything. I think we mentioned in Kenneth Taylor's translation, I think in the Living Bible, I believe it's Taylor translates this submission passage as wives, fit in with your husband's plans. All right, under that scripture then, here is a list of suggested do's that I believe are valid. Wife, covenant with yourself and with the Lord to be your husband's champion, to be his number one booster, to stand with him and to encourage him even if nobody else does, and to cherish your relationship to him even in situations where he fails or where he's wrong. Number one, be your husband's champion, his number one booster, the lifter of his head. Number two, cultivate gratitude for your husband. Cultivate it. Concentrate on it. Cultivate gratitude for your husband and express it to him. Don't just be glad inside. Tell him that you're grateful for him. I want to say personally that there have been days in my life, and I know there have been in yours, there have been days in my life when the only good thing that happened to me came when Alice said, "Honey, I thank God for you." And if nothing else good happened that day, boy, that day turned out better than it would have otherwise. Men, cultivate gratitude. Wives, cultivate gratitude for your husbands and the ability to express that gratitude to him. Third point, show an intelligent interest in his work or in his ministry or in his career. Now, this may seem kind of obvious, but it's amazing to me at times when I've counseled with people in troubled marriages, or women have come to me charismatic meetings afterwards and want me to pray for their husbands or so forth, and it's obvious that they've got problems and their husbands often aren't saved and they're very critical and so forth, and it's a matter of courtesy and a matter of common interest. I'll say to the wife who comes to say, "Pray for my husband," I'll say, "What kind of work is your husband in?" And oftentimes he'll kind of draw blanks there. "Oh, he works in an office," or "He works in a factory." And I push it. I say, "What is he doing now?" And it's amazing how often the wife just doesn't seem to know. "He works in a factory." "Oh, he puts pieces together." Well, what is he, And you can see right there one of the basic problems in the marriage. She really hasn't cultivated an interest in her husband's work or in his career. So one of the ways in which you can be his booster, one of the ways in which you can enhance your marriage is that you need to show an intelligent interest in his work. You see, what many wives fail to see, because wives perhaps are more vocal than men, wives like to hear their husbands say that they love them. And that's not always easy for a husband to say. You ought to say it. Men, you ought to say it. But I tell you, wives, one of the things that you need to learn and appreciate is that your husband expresses his love for you in his work and in how he provides for you. His devotion to you and to the children and to the home is expressed in his faithfulness to his job and into his career. He's not doing that just for himself. He's doing that over a period of years and that discipline and so forth in order to provide lovingly for you and for the home and for the children. So that means you need to understand that his work, his job, his career is an expression of his love for you. And when you don't show an intelligent interest or concern for that, then in a sense your indifference or your attitude is demeaning, and it diminishes him in his own mind at least, and he feels diminished in your sight. Along with this, which is a parallel statement, the fourth point is, in other words, look for and appreciate evidences of his love apart from what he says, apart from the words. Because he may always have trouble being able to articulate how he feels. A lot of men are like the traditional movie hero in the cowboy movies. He's a strong, silent type, can't speak to his heroine, but he goes out and gets on his horse and he'll talk to his horse. I mean, men find it easier to communicate with other men or with animals or things oftentimes easier than they are able to communicate with their wives. Especially, I want to be careful how I say this, but it seems as if the more masculine a man is, and the more lovely and feminine his wife is, or the woman he loves is, the more awkward he feels in trying to communicate sensitive things to her, in trying to articulate or to verbalize things. She has the ability to slice him up and down with her tongue, and she's got a much more handier and wieldinger that weapon, and she can run circles around him with that tongue, and she can rip him up one side down the other, and sooner or later he'll get fed up with it and he'll bop her one, because that's the only way he can get his point across. Now, that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but it is true. Women are articulate. Brother Ern talking about the women outside his hotel room the other night, when there's all yakety, 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 and what a hen party was going. Now, that's not a criticism. That's just fact. That women are vocal creatures. God made them that way. But you need, because of that, when you don't avoid trying to transfer what you're like onto your husband and expect him to be that way. You wouldn't like it if he was. Thank God that he's a man. Thank God that he's masculine. Thank God that he may have trouble articulating in words how he feels, but look at what he does. Look for evidences of his love apart from the words that he says. 6th point. Very important point. Put an asterisk by this one. 5. 5th point. You're right on top of things. Learn to honor your husband's attitude and perspective about situations, and try to make his attitude and perspective your own. That's back to submitting to your husband. Wives, fit in with your husband's plan. Now, please understand me. That doesn't mean that every opinion of yours has to dovetail with his. But I'm talking about him in his leadership role and his responsibility as the head of the house and as the one who has to care for you and the children and who has to look at things from a perspective of decision-making and long-range care for the family. Learn to honor your husband's attitude and perspective and try to make it your own. Try to see it from his point of view. Now, you won't always succeed, and it's not always necessary for you to succeed, but some women never make the effort. Some women, whatever it is their husband's for, they're against. Just, wouldn't you call it the battle of the sexes or whatever it is? It's just sort of a built-in knee-jerk reaction. If the husband looks at something from his point of view, remember, he's the rational creature. He's dominated by his intellect. God made him that way in order that he could rule and make the decisions and run the home and be the protector of his family. And women tend to respond to things emotionally. And oftentimes, ladies, your perspective will come out of your emotions. And that's not wrong necessarily. But you have to understand that your husband may not make decisions based upon your emotional response to situations. So you need to make the effort to see his perspective. Learn to honor him in his role as the head of the house, honor his attitude and his perspective, and try to make it your own. Many a wife, without meaning to, sides with her husband's adversaries. Let me give you kind of an example. The husband's a salesman. He comes home, he's had a bad day. He says to his wife, I've really been working hard at landing this big a new account, and somehow I didn't do it. It slipped through my fingers, and boy, the boss really chewed me out. He's coming home and he's laying this on his wife because he's seeking some comfort, encouragement. Now, the wife can respond in 2 ways. She can respond as a supportive, loving wife, or she can agree with his adversary. There are 2 responses. She has 2 choices. If she agrees with the adversary, she'd say, well, I warned you if you didn't look out, you'd lose that account. I told you you better be careful. A lot of women respond that way. Whatever it is, when the husband opens up and admits some weakness or failure, I told you, I warned you. Or she can take his perspective, she can be the lifter of his head and say something like this. That's okay, honey, I know you did your best. Don't worry, you'll land the next account, I know you will. I have confidence in you. Now, this is just a made-up example, but I think you ladies, men too, you ladies can understand what I'm talking about. And judge your own attitude and your own action. When things like this happen, or problems or difficulties or controversy arise, who do you side with? Do you side with your husband, or you side with his adversary? A husband can get mighty tired of trying to defend himself and to stand his ground, not only when people outside are against him, but when he has to defend himself against his wife as well. In that regard, I'll tell you something, ladies. It's a rare husband who will ever rise above his wife's expectations of him. Now, it can happen, but it ain't likely to happen. I'll say it again. It's a rare husband who will ever rise above his wife's expectation of him. If you expect your husband to live his life as a country bumpkin, he'll probably fulfill your expectations. If you expect your husband to be a success or a champion or effective or efficient in whatever he's called to do and in his role as a husband and as a worker, in all likelihood he'll bust a gusset trying to prove and to come up to your expectations of him. Time and again, back to situations where I've been teaching and afterwards women would come, so more often than men, in these charismatic meetings, so more often it's women come and say, pray for my husband. He isn't here, he's not a Christian, or he's not this or not that. And so often there's such a demeaning attitude in what they say. Pray for my husband. Well, what is he? He's not a Christian. Well, my husband just won't take any leadership in the home. Well, sister, you ought to try to honor your husband and be the lifter of his head and encourage him. You mean I have to stay with that guy even though he's not measuring up? Yes, sister, you said. Well, I guess I'll just have to go through life married to a ninny. That's the exact words. I had a woman come to me in Florida one time some years ago, and when I tried to encourage her to look positively on her marriage, and she got nothing. Well, I'll just have to spend the rest of my life married to a ninny. And you know what? I bet my bottom dollar she's doing just that. Because that's all she expects him to be. Ladies, that's so stupid. That's so unfortunate. 6th point, along with this, remember that, wives, that your security and your welfare may well be dependent upon your husband's success in fulfilling his leadership role in your life. It's like cutting off your nose to spite your face, to be critical and demeaning towards your husband. Your own security, your own welfare, your own peace, your own joy, your own happiness in your marriage may largely be dependent upon how you respond to your husband, how you're able to help him fulfill his responsibility as the man God has placed over you in the Lord. Okay, and now a few don'ts for wives. Wives, don't be complainers. Don't be complainers. Let me read just a couple of Proverbs. Proverbs 25:24. The man who wrote this, I'm sure, was writing it out of experience. Better to live on a corner of the roof than share a house with a quarrelsome wife. Now, the guy who wrote that was feeling kind of desperate, Ern. He was under it. He said, man, if I could just find a little quiet corner on the roof somewhere, boy, that'd be great. Be away from that nagging wife. Another one, probably the same guy wrote this one. Chapter 27:15. A quarrelsome wife is like a constant dripping on a rainy day. I think the Bible isn't picturesque in its description. Nag, 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 nag. All day long. Ladies, let me encourage you at this point to realize this, that most of the time, if you're wise and prudent and faithful, most of the time you can get your point across and get your way without nagging, without complaining. It just takes finesse. It just takes a little bit of savvy. It just takes a little bit of proper use of feminine wiles and cunning. The old saying is that, sugar catches more flies than vinegar. Or isn't it something like honey catches more wives than vinegar? Now here's a hypothetical example. Wife wants her husband to paint the kitchen. And, it's been going long and he hasn't painted the kitchen. Now, there are two ways she can stress the point of what that means to her. And this is often the kind of thing that she does. I've been telling you for months I want the kitchen painted. But you just never seem to listen. You don't care at all about the things that I want. Nag, 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 nag. Now, sisters, I know you may be justified in that. The guy may be kind of lazy and he puts off things and so forth, and you have a right to have your kitchen painted, bless your heart. But there's another way to go about it. Honey, I'm still looking forward to getting the kitchen painted. Do you think we can get it done by the end of the summer? Now, you know what? It's one of the devil's sneaky tricks is the fact that it's true that you can achieve your goal by nagging and complaining. If you get bitchy enough, if you get mean enough and cross enough, and nagging enough and complaining enough, finally you'll drive your poor old husband in desperation to do it. And you'll get your cotton-picking kitchen painted that way. But let me tell you something. There's small reward in getting it that way. And even if you get it, you won't be happy with it, because deep down you know it didn't come about the right way. And not only that, when you get in that roller coaster, that kind of attitude, once you get your kitchen painted, all that'll do is just, instead of feeling grateful, you'll just turn to the next project to nag about. After the kitchen, it'll be something else. It's kind of a law of diminishing returns. The more you nag, even if you get what you want, the less satisfaction there will be in it. Much better way is to be gentle, encouraging, sympathetic, and to pray for your husband. And to pray that God will make him sensitive that the kitchen needs a paint job. Much better to pray and ask God to inspire your husband and to open your husband's eyes and to make him sensitive to the things that are important to you. God hears and answers prayer. And your husband really loves you. He may be insensitive to some things. He doesn't see the things in your world that you see. But if you pray, a number of things can happen. One is that you'll begin to feel better just because you pray. And you turn the situation over to God and you begin to look to him. And don't be surprised if God doesn't adjust your attitude somewhat. God may say, all right, dear, you be patient and we'll work on your husband, and you wait, you're going to get your kitchen painted. But sometimes God may side with your husband. God may say, dearie, he's busy enough now, don't pester him about the kitchen. You have to allow for that possibility, ladies. Ladies, don't nag. A second don't for wives. Don't criticize your husband's driving. Okay? Don't criticize your husband's driving. Now, there is a way you can do it, ladies. Again, it's a techniques involved. Herbert, slow down. Don't drive like that. Don't you see that sign? Don't you see that? Herbert, slow down. You're going too fast. Better way to do that, sister. Honey, I'm really feeling nervous and edgy today. Would you mind just slowing it down a little? I'm so jumpy. You know what that elicits from your husband? Concern. My wife's had a hard day. He wants to please you. He wants to do what's right. But see, you're not nagging in that response. You want him to slow down for a valid reason, which is that, that it's bothering you. But you know what happens? Ladies, you're just going to have to take my word for this as a man. When you criticize your husband's driving, you're challenging his manhood. Now, I don't know why that's true, but that's just true. And every man here knows it's true. There's something about being behind the wheel of the car that increases a man's masculinity. Vroom, vroom, vroom. And if you don't know it, but if you criticize his driving, you're knocking a hole in his manhood, or he thinks you are. And please, please, ladies, don't show him the parking place on the other side of the street. All right? That's really a big help. You're driving down the street, this side of the street, looking for a parking place. It's all full, and the wife says, honey, there's one over there. Heard Bob Mumford mention this one time. He and Judy were driving down the street. Honey, there's a parking place over there. Bob grabbed the steering wheel and said, "Judy, don't you realize I'll drive 5 blocks to find a parking place beside that one?" Ladies, don't criticize your husband's driving. By handling it right, you encourage him to be considerate, and you appeal to his manhood to keep you at peace and to look after your needs. Third, don't assume leadership. Don't move into his realm or role of leadership, even if he seems inadequate. Now, I realize this, ladies, this is a great task. It's a great responsibility, a great challenge, and it's very difficult to do. But the truth is that God has so designed a family that there's only one driver's seat. Family has, like an automobile tractor going down the road, only one driver's seat. Now, from time to time, you may feel like your husband's not sitting in that seat, and certain things aren't being done, his leadership responsibilities, driving, leading the family. But dear, just remember this: the moment you climb into that seat, there's absolutely no room for him. And you getting into that seat's not going to solve anything at all. It's just going to prolong the difficulty. Now, I'm aware that at times necessity requires certain things that you have to do that you'd rather your husband do. I'm not trying to be unrealistic. All I'm saying is that if you're sensitive, you'll come to see that there are certain things that though you would like to have him do them, and that you may feel they're his responsibility to do as the head of the house, better to leave those things undone than in exasperation saying, "Well, if my husband won't do it, I'll do it myself." Let them go undone. And take your husband's perspective, identify with your husband, put up with his shortcomings, even though he doesn't see all those things. Make loving suggestions from time to time, but don't get in the driver's seat, because that will simply compound the problem. Fourth, don't for wives. And this is important. We're going to look at it in the Scripture. Turn to Genesis chapter 16. It's another one I put an asterisk by. And I know this is hard to learn, and husbands, you're going to have to help your wives with this. But wives, don't pronounce your fears as fact. Don't take a stand in which you make a statement which make it sound like that your fear is a fact. And women are so prone to do that. Husbands, they need our help at this point. Women often are dominated by fear. By nature, they tend to be more fearful than men. And men, it's our responsibility to help them with that. But ladies, you have a responsibility to learn, with your husband's help or without it, learn not to pronounce or to consider your fear as a fact. Now let's read a little in Genesis chapter 16. Bearing in mind, this is the story of Sarah and Abraham and the fact that he didn't have children. And Sarah comes up with an idea about Abraham taking Hagar, her handmaiden, for a wife. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar, and so she said to Abraham, "The Lord has kept me from having children." Ladies, men, that's an example of what I'm talking about. God had already promised Abraham that they would have children. It was a matter of timing, and they were to be living and operating in faith. But the time came through impatience and through fear that Sarah, in her exasperation and in her impatience, gave voice to her fear as if it were a fact. God has prevented me from having children. No, he hadn't. There was a proper time when it was coming. But once she pronounced that fear as a fact, she set on a course, and Abram went along with it. She set on a course that led to disaster. God, the Lord, has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Oh my, wasn't that spiritual? So humble, so spiritual, so self-sacrificing was Sarah after she had given over to her fear. Abram, take my lovely handmaid Hagar, and maybe we can have children and a family by her. Abram failed his wife at this point. He should have dealt with what she did, giving in to her fear and pronouncing it as a fact. He should have said, "Honey, no dice. Now just hang in there. I know you're feeling a little uneasy, but God has promised." It's not true that God has has stopped up your womb and that God is preventing you from having children. God has promised. We just have to be faithful till the time comes. But instead, he gave in to the same fear, gave in to this very earthy attraction that was coming up. After all, he was a man with normal desires and so forth, and in his old human nature side, this seemed very appealing. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. After all, Hagar is a beautiful young woman. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah took his wife took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife, and he slept with her, and she conceived. And when she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And then Sarah said to Abraham, "You're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. It's all your fault. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Well, basically, Abraham got what he deserved. He should have stood for what he knew was right in God, but instead he gave in. It's another classic case of abdication of male authority and of a woman assuming authority that wasn't hers. But on this case, it stemmed out of a very tragic act on the part of Hagar, and that is that she gave in to her fear as if it were a fact. Ladies, don't do that. Don't pronounce your fears as facts. All right, now turn with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And I want to take just a couple of minutes in a very gentle and I trust discreet and tasteful way to say something about the sex relationship between husbands and wives. The Bible doesn't have a whole lot of detailed instructions about how men and women ought to conduct themselves in the marriage relationship, but it says enough. And there's enough in this little few verses of chapter 7 to lay down the principles that can cover most situations. Chapter 7, verse 4. Well, let's back up and say, let's read the first of the chapter. "Now, for the matters you wrote about," somebody been asking Paul questions about the marriage relationship. "It is good for a man not to marry, but since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." Very earthy, very practical advice that Paul is giving. Now I want to say just a few basic things about this relationship, simply because you can't really do justice to the topic of men and women relationships without touching on this, because the sexual part of our lives is such a dominant part of life in marriage. There would be things that, if I were speaking only to a group of men, there would be much more things that I would be tending to say, and much more in detail and much more positively. But with both husbands and wives here, there are still some things that I would simply like to observe. One is that there's perhaps no other more powerful drive or influence in a marriage than the sex drive, than the sex relationship. It is a powerful, powerful thing that dominates lives in many ways. Now that doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, when God made creation and made man and woman, He said it was good. God was the one who thought up the family. God was the one who thought up sex as the means for procreation. God's the one who made us male and female. And God, when He had done that, said it was good. And it's the will of God. It was God who brought Eve to Adam and joined her together in marriage. It was God who said, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth." It's God's sanction that's on the sexual relationship in marriage. And so sex basically is good. It's not shameful. It's not something to be snickered at. It's not something to learn about off of public restroom walls and obscenities and pornography and all the rest. But you would think in our current culture it is true that in our current culture that's where much information or much misinformation and much temptation and much degradation occurs. Scripturally, there is a very sound principle about how the marriage relationship ought to work, the sexual relationship in marriage. And basically it's this. The rule for happiness in marriage or in anything else, the rule for happiness and fulfillment is in giving rather than in getting. This is the meaning of covenant. Your welfare at my expense. In our marriage covenant, Alice's welfare at my expense. Now, from Alice's viewpoint, it's also true that it's my welfare at her expense. This is the point that Paul is making when he says, the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Now, men, women, husbands, wives, if we can come to understand this, it'll put a whole new, beautiful sanctity in the marriage relationship. It's because that relationship is so powerful and so demanding. The sex drive so demanding, the urge is so powerful, especially in the male and to a certain degree in the female. But because it is such a powerful force, it is subject to so much abuse and to so much misunderstanding. But God very clearly sets out what the rules are to be. Basically, to have the highest fulfillment in your marriage relationship, both the husband and wife should realize that their responsibility in the marriage act, in sexual union, is to fulfill the desires and needs and to give pleasure to the other. And if we understand that, in the end, we're going to find the highest pleasure for ourselves. Unfortunately, many people enter into the sexual relationship without that in mind. They are primarily concerned with their own satisfaction or their own fulfillment. And God knows the literature market is full of how-to manuals with explicit instructions and photographs and illustrations that offer you 601 ways to find your own fulfillment. And it just puts those things just put sex one level ahead of the animal, for the animal expression of it. If you're thinking only in terms of physical relief or physical pleasure or the satisfying of your own needs, you're not really thinking of it in terms of the marriage covenant. You're approaching it on a lesser base, on a lower plane, on a more animalistic plane. Because in its highest and in its best, the sexual union in marriage is to represent the covenant of marriage between the husband and wife, each desiring to fulfill the need and to give himself totally or herself totally to the other. This is what Paul is struggling to say when he says that about marriage, that he says it's a mystery. Nevertheless, it's like Christ's union with the church. Now, I know because of many of us a lot of our education came from unspiritual sources when it comes to matters of sex. It's difficult for us to think spiritually about the sexual relationship. But there's something to be understood in that passage in Ephesians. When Paul is quoting that passage out of Genesis and out of Matthew 18 where it says, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. Husbands, wives, we need to come to understand eventually and to see that in some beautiful, holy way, the basic sexual union between a husband and his wife represents the mystical love that Christ has for the church. I also think this ought to offer some guidelines about what's permissible in sex and what's not. I'm not going to spend much more time on this, and I realize I'm treading on very delicate ground. And I don't want to be critical of any husband or wife or any couple who is finding fulfillment in their sexual relationship and they're happy with it and they're pleased with it, because it is a very intimate and sacred thing, and you have to be very careful about intruding into it. So I want to make it plain. If you're happy and you're satisfied with your sexual relationship, I don't care how unusual or how bizarre it might be from somebody else's standards, if you're happy with it, then I have no right, and anyone else has any right to say anything about it. But in pastoral counseling and in the deliverance ministry, trying to meet people's needs, we have come into contact with people who are laboring under such guilt and such shame and such agony and such unhappiness that's brought about by an unhappy sexual relationship. And nearly in every case, it proves to be that it's because they've been thinking more in terms of their own satisfaction than in someone else, than in their marriage partner. And it happens time and time again when we've dealt with counseling and with people that come for deliverance from demons, that in many cases, most cases it would be a woman, but in some cases it would be the man. The problem that comes out is that the woman, or sometimes the man, but the woman feels shamed and degraded and humiliated because the husband has made what she feels is an unholy demand upon her in terms of sexual activity. That he has gone beyond the bounds of propriety and is treating her body like a sex object and is more concerned about his own satisfaction, his own fulfillment. So he more or less forces her or shames her into a performance in sexual activity that humiliates and degrades and puts her down and often breaks her spirit. And there's a tremendous lot of this in Christian marriages. And occasionally the same thing's true of a husband. When a wife can do the same thing, it's more apt to be the husband. Let me just make a couple of comments about that. A lot of marriages have problems between husband and wives that don't originate in the marriage bed, but they are compounded in the marriage bed. And when the problem is already existing, oftentimes both a husband and wife will take that problem into the marriage bed and try to deal with it or try to get an edge or an advantage in it in that relationship. Many a weak husband who isn't properly able to lead his wife or to care for his wife or feels inadequate in other ways in his leadership will cruelly dominate his wife in bed, try to shame her or humiliate her to prove his superiority. And let me tell you something, ladies, a rebellious wife knows what a tremendous weapon she has with sex, in that she can humiliate her husband, and she can literally strip him of his manhood by ridiculing his performance in bed, or by refusing him his rights, conjugal rights as a marriage partner. I'll tell you, it can be a powerful, deadly weapon. But I'll say it again, God is the one who made us sexual creatures. God made sex good. It's the devil who has perverted it. And if we enter into the marriage relationship, remembering that it is a representation of Christ's mystical union with the church, if we enter into it with a realization that we do not rule our own bodies, and that our responsibilities as husbands and wives is to give ourselves to the other and to be more concerned about their satisfaction and about their pleasure and their fulfillment than in our own, then that basic sexual union with God's help can be totally fulfilling. Let me say one other thing before we leave the subject. Weird, innovative, kinky sex is no cure for an ailing marriage or its inadequacy. Unfortunately, at times, couples will try that. They're not getting along in other ways, and they don't find satisfaction in what we'd consider a normal sexual relationship, so they get all the latest weird manuals and with all the weird positions and types of perverted sex and so forth, and give themselves totally to that with a misinterpretation of the Scripture that the marriage bed is undefiled, as it says in Hebrews. That doesn't mean that anything goes in the marriage bed. If that were true, we wouldn't be dealing with shamed and humiliated and hurt and broken people who have been victimized in the sex relationship in their own marriage. The answer to it is that if you accept and apply scriptural principles and enter into the sexual part of your marriage with the advice that Paul gives, with the idea that you are to love and serve and comfort and minister and put your partner's needs ahead of your own, then you'll be fulfilling the scriptural requirements. Your sex life will improve. There will be no attractiveness to deviant sexual behavior, and you will fulfill the Scripture that says for husband and wives that they love one another as Christ loved the church. Okay, finally, time's gotten away. I'm at the end now. But I want to say some things in conclusion, if God will give me the grace and the ability to sum up and to articulate. I'd like to end with a reaffirmation of a high and holy view of marriage. Remember again that it was God's idea, the family, sexual union, marriage, male and female. God made the man, put him in the garden. But then the Scriptures tells us in Genesis 2 that the Lord God said, "It's not good for the man to be alone. I'll make a helper suitable for him. I believe that means that in God's sight, man will never rise to his full divine potential in life without a wife, and vice versa. Now, I won't allow for all kinds of exceptions. Some people are called to celibacy by God. Others, through circumstances, never find a mate. I'm aware of all those things. A lot of things about singles that we could have said we haven't been able to touch in this time. But my basic conviction out of my own scriptural study is that man will not rise to his full divine potential without a wife, and vice versa. And marriage, I want to suggest that marriage at its highest and its best is a sacrament of grace in which the husband, both the husband and the wife, become kind of divine instruments of redemption and preservation for their mates. They become sort of instruments in the hands of God, servants of his salvation and his redemption. There are certain things that God delegates to the husband and to the wife to minister to their respective mates that he will not do apart from that. And so there's a sense in which they become redemptive instruments in that divine institution of marriage. And it has, how it works, I don't know whether I can articulate it, but it has something to do with being chosen. Now, in another lesson, another subject, I say some things about how Israel had to come to the place where they knew they were chosen by God. Israel as a nation became something when God chose that nation. And they had a special destiny, and that's going to be fulfilled, not because of their response, but because they were the object of God's choice. Well, there's a truth about that concerning the marriage relationship. It has something to do with being chosen, because to be chosen is to become special in a very special way. How can I say it? Alice, my wife, is more special and precious to me than any other person on earth. Now, why is that? Because she's more beautiful or more wonderful or more talented or all of that sort of thing? No, she is beautiful and she is wonderful. But no, those are not the reasons. She is special to me in a special way, and I am special to her in a special way because we have chosen each other. And something happens when a young man chooses a wife, the woman that's to be his wife, and he places his love upon her. She then becomes clothed with a kind of divinity or a kind of something, aura, a kind of enhancement, a kind of glory, because she is the object of his choice. There is a sense, a kind of divine wonder begins to work in the fact once we choose our mate or our mate chooses us. It allows God to begin to do something. It has something to do with the whole idea of romance, the whole idea of being special. To know that you're more than any other person in the earth, you're special to someone, that you mean more to them than anyone else does. It begins to awaken something in you, begins to do something in you that nothing else can do. I'm talking as a romanticist, and I know it, but I think there's divinity in it. One of the things I appreciate about the songs of the 30s and 40s and 50s, the romantic ballads, is that they often express this. When I was making these notes, I was reminded, I used to love the music of Jerome Kern and the beautiful ballads that he read. He wrote one, the music, I'm not sure he wrote the words, it might have been Oscar Hammerstein, but because they often collaborated, but I believe perhaps Jerome Kern wrote both words and music to a very beautiful ballad called They'll Never Believe Me. And in it he says, when I tell them how wonderful you are, they'll never believe me, they'll never believe me. Your eyes, your lips, your cheeks, your hair are in a class beyond compare. You're a beautiful girl to see. And when I tell them, and I certainly am going to tell them, that I'm the guy whose wife you will one day be, they'll never believe me. They'll never believe me that in this whole wide world you've chosen me. That expresses the sentiments of what I'm talking about. The wonder. The whole world wouldn't believe it, but I chose Alice. And wonder of wonders, she chose me. And something begins to happen. When a man chooses a woman for his wife and places his love upon her, then something wonderful begins to happen in her because she's chosen. because she's cherished, because she's special in a special way. Some hidden graces and beauty and charm began to emerge that somehow the husband knew were there anyway, or at least he could see them. They say love is blind. No, love isn't blind. It sees with another set of eyes. All brides are beautiful, and all husbands are strong and handsome, because love sees through a different set of eyes. The wonder of being chosen. I think God wants us to be aware of that as Christian husbands and wives, learning how to love and to care for one another.